Good morning. I am Nadine Attal. I'm a professor of Therapeutics and Pain Medicine. I'm a neurologist by practice, and I'm very happy to do this presentation for the NIH on developing meaningful endpoints for pain clinical trials, the European perspective, with particular emphasis on neuropathic pain. So in this presentation, I would really like to provide to you the European perspective with regards to meaningful endpoints for pain clinical trials. This is my declaration of interest. Now, in this short presentation, I would like first to emphasize the neuropathic pain European medical agencies approvals in Europe, and you will see that they are slightly differ from those of the FDA. And then I will also rapidly outline the detection diagnosis of neuropathic pain in clinical trials, what EMA also recommends to this respect. And then finally, I will end up with the clinical endpoints for neuropathic pain clinical trials and also the recommendations of EMA in this respect. So as you probably know, neuropathic pain is not a single pain condition. It is indeed a multi-etiology pain. That means that it is an entity which is related to many etiologies, including peripheral nerve injuries such as diabetic polyneuropathies or postherpetic neuralgia, but also central conditions such as multiple sclerosis or stroke. So it's a multi-etiology pain, and that's important. And that's important because it's not only a multi-etiology pain, it's also a multi-dimensional pain syndrome. On this slide, you can see that there are many symptoms pertaining to neuropathic pain, including, for instance, burning pain or paroxysmal pain. However, despite these heterogeneous symptoms, all of them are shared by multiple etiological conditions. This means that multiple etiological conditions share similar symptoms and also probably similar mechanisms. And this indicates, and this has some therapeutic implications because it suggests that the treatment and hence therapeutic recommendations should not necessarily be driven by the etiology of neuropathic pain. And so this has implications also for the approvals of use of drug treatments in Europe, because EMA approvals in this respect have for the past decades been granted for peripheral or central neuropathic pain in general, and not necessarily for specific etiological conditions. And so these are the guidelines to justify a general indication for the treatment of neuropathic pain. It has to be demonstrated in central and peripheral neuropathic pain. And you can see some examples of the models proposed, but it is not restrictive. Efficacy should be shown in at least 2 models of peripheral neuropathic pain for peripheral indications, and simple model of central neuropathic pain is enough. And you can see here the drugs approved for neuropathic pain in Europe, and there's a number of them, including pregabalin, gabapentin, some tricyclic agents, even carbamazepine, an old indication, and capsaicin high concentration patches. Now I'd like to move on to another very important issue in clinical trials, which is of course, the population and how to diagnose or detect neuropathic pain for clinical trials, and what are EMA recommendations in this regard. You probably know that over the past decade or so, there have been a number of clinical questionnaires, that have been specifically developed and validated for the purpose of screening neuropathic pain or discriminating neuropathic pain from other types of pain, and essentially nociceptive pain or inflammatory pain. And these include, but this is not restricted, but essentially the Lanz scale, the DN4 questionnaire, which we validated years ago with Didier Boissera, and the Pain Detect questionnaire. For instance, the DN4, which is widely used now, has been translated and also revalidated in multiple languages. And these are the languages in which it was completely revalidated, and it has been translated in more than 80 different languages. And what are the recommendations? And this is important because these questionnaires have been validated. And so the EMA acknowledges this and proposes that in clinical trials of neuropathic pain, patients' pain at baseline should be, of course, categorized according to relative contributions of nociceptive and neuropathic components. And EMA acknowledges the use and the relevance of screening questionnaires such as the Lanz, Pain Detect, and DN4 particularly, and acknowledges that they may help to identify patients with the neuropathic components. And there are some suggestions also that this might, in some cases, enhance the assay sensitivity to some treatments. But now I'd like really to focus on the most, I think, important part of this presentation, which is the clinical endpoints for neuropathic pain clinical trials. What is the current situation? You all know that in the large majority of clinical trials of pain, chronic pain in particular, the primary endpoint is an unidimensional measure of self-reported average pain intensity over the past 24 hours. And this generally includes numerical rating scale for pain intensity and less commonly, visual analog scale for pain intensity. According to the impact recommendations, which have been chaired or co-chaired by Robert Dworkin for more than now 15 years, 2005, you have many of these published in pain. Not only there should be one or sometimes two primary outcome or co-primary outcome that should include pain intensity, but there should be a number of secondary outcomes, and these generally include additional measures of pain intensity, such as, for instance, categorical measures of pain, or several types of pain intensities like worst pain or least pain, multidimensional questionnaires such as the McGilpin questionnaire, the measure of pain relief, measures of quality of sleep or psychological comorbidities and function, and global measures of improvement. And so this is, of course, totally applicable and totally relevant for neuropathic pain. But there are some specificities. And I'd like now to focus on the reason why there are some specificities. Now you can look at a very famous trial which was published in 1998 in JAMA, which concerns one of the pivotal trials of gabapentin in peripheral neuropathic pain. This was in diabetic painful neuropathy. And you can see that there's gabapentin here, according to a numerical rating scale from 0 to 10, and this is the placebo. And the main difference here, the average difference with the placebo, was in this trial considered as relatively good. It was about 1.5. But in many of the trials, the difference between active drug and the placebo is much less than 1 point out of 10. It's generally between 0.5 to 0.8 or 0.9. So that means that the average difference from between the active drug and the placebo is generally very, very modest indeed. And this is also illustrated by meta-analysis such as this one, which was recently conducted with nanofinrip. And this is not based on the effect size, but rather on the number needed to treat to obtain a good responder relative to placebo. And the highest the NNT, the lowest the efficacy. And so they can see in these numerous meta-analyses published from 2004 up to now, or 2017, then that the number needed to treat needs to seems to be increased in recent trials. That means that the efficacy of drugs seem to apparently to decrease over time versus placebo, and this might be related to several reasons. I won't have time to expose them. And so that's the problem. And the problem which is outlined by these results is really the heterogeneity of responses to therapy in neuropathic pain clinical trials. And so this problem has led multiple experts since actually 1998, so it is not recent, since Clifford Wolf in particular in the United States, to recommend a more personalized mechanism-based approach for the treatment of neuropathic pain in order to decrease therapeutic failure. And these are examples of such recommendations, expert recommendations. Now, the underlying hypothesis for this is that symptoms of neuropathic pain, such as burning or squeezing or paroxysmal pain, which I briefly presented to you previously, are related to underlying mechanisms. And this is one, of course, underlying hypothesis. And now, what can we do in clinical trials to further assess these symptoms? Well, we and others have developed over the past decade as well, so a number of questionnaires, and these are the main questionnaires that have been developed and validated for the purpose of better assessing specifically in the neuropathic pain symptoms, neuropathic pain scale, NPSI, which we validated with Didier Westira in 2004, SF-McGill type 2, which is also for nociceptive pain, and the PQS, pain quality assessment scale. Regarding the NPSI, it has been also really revalidated and back translated and translated in multiple languages, and is now very often used in several clinical trials for neuropathic pain. And what is the potential added value of these pain quality questionnaires in clinical trials of neuropathic pain? Well, first of all, they may indicate selective effects of therapy, but they may also identify predictors of the response to therapy, which is one step towards personalized or individualized pain management. This is an example of studies of botulinum toxin type A, which we did some years ago, and this is the primary outcome here. This is a significant effect on numerical pain rating scale. But you can see here that there was even a more prominent and very good response to some sub-symptoms, some subtypes of neuropathic pain. Here, paroxysmal pain was particularly prone to respond to this drug, much more than other symptoms of neuropathic pain, such as squeezing pain or deep pain or even burning pain was less responsive to than paroxysmal pain. So this indicates that there might be some selective effects of some drugs on selective dimensions or symptoms of neuropathic pain. This is also outlined by another trial. With this one was with a new drug, chemokine receptor antagonist, completely negative on the primary outcome, yet positive in subgroups, in subtypes of neuropathic pain symptoms, essentially paroxysmal pain again and paresthesia. So that means that in some cases, you might obtain an effect on some pain dimensions, even if the study is negative on the primary outcome. And you can see here that this is not specific to drugs, because other authors, for instance, this study with using TDCS, which is transcranial direct current stimulation, may also indicate some selective effect on pain symptoms. Another interesting aspect of these questionnaires is that they may identify predictors of the response to therapy. Actually, this, of course, is not completely validated, because in all these examples, and these are all trials that use the NPSI as a major secondary outcome measure. In all these trials, some of them were positive, some of them were negative. These trials identified, based on the NPSI, that some patients, based on particular phenotypes, for instance, combination of burning pain and paroxysmal pain, were more responsive to some of the drugs exposed here. But these are still post-hoc analyses, so it has not been still yet possible to firmly demonstrate the relevance of this in predefined outcome and predefined clinical trials. And this is important, of course, to discuss together. And so what are the email recommendations taken into account what I told previously? What they say is that measurement with a unidimensional or multidimensional assessment questionnaire should be done, and this should be validated for the model used. Of course, pain intensity is still the key measure, but the main shortcomings of the single item pain rating scales is that they do not cover the whole range of pain quality. So EMA recommends to use multidimensional outcome measures, including NPSI or other measures, to be used either as primary outcome or in addition to the primary outcome as major secondary outcome, in order to reveal differential effects on treatments. And another important issue in this respect is the fact that a very recent European initiative, which is a very important one, sponsored by multiple companies, IMI Pain Care, also has an outcome measure, which is a goal, which is the patient-reported outcomes to improve management of chronic pain, including some of these questionnaires. However, and I just told you previously that it was important to differentiate the different symptoms of neuropathic pain, but in the same time, there are also some trials, and these are unpublished trials yet, so I cannot give you more information about these, that show also that some very, very global measures of pain, on even not only pain, but improvement, using the PGIC might even be more sensitive to treatment outcome than intensity measures, such as the NRS pain intensity. And these two studies should be published within the next weeks or months. And so now, before ending, giving the conclusions, my suggestions to this very important, I think, problem is that the choice of the primary endpoint in clinical trials of neuropathic pain should probably depend on the targeted mechanism of action of the treatment. If the treatment has a very selective action, perhaps we may use a multi-dimensional questionnaire, because it might probably be more sensitive to a specific effect of a drug on some pain qualities, such as pain paroxysm, for instance. But conversely, if the treatment is expected to have a very large profile, a very broad effect on pain or quality of life, such as psychotherapy or RTMS or even antidepressants, then probably a global scale should be preferred, NRS, pain intensity, but also perhaps PGIC. So the key message is that I think the use of multiple efficacy endpoints for pain clinical trials, of course, is mandatory. But the choice of the primary endpoint, I think, might be based on the presumed mechanism of action of the treatment and the patient population. And of course, this has to be viewed in the context of more the prospect of personalized pain medicine, which is a very important strategy to improve therapeutic outcome, including, but not limited, of course, to neuropathic pain. And so I thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.